On a gray, rain-slicked evening, a weathered farmhouse stands solitary against a bruised sky, its peeling white paint flaking like old scars, its sagging porch groaning under the weight of years left untended. The wind howls low, rattling loose shutters and sending a shiver through the overgrown fields that stretch into the dusk. Inside, a faint glow spills from the kitchen window, cutting through the gloom like a fragile lifeline. Sarah, a 58-year-old woman with tired eyes shadowed by dark circles and a frail frame that seems to shrink with each passing day, stands at the stove. She stirs a pot of soup, thin, watery broth, all she can manage now, her hands trembling not just from age, but from the illness that's begun to gnaw at her bones. Her gray hair, once vibrant, hangs limp around her shoulders, and her breath catches faintly as she works, a quiet reminder of her fading strength. The room is steeped in stillness, save for the soft hiss of the gas burner and the occasional drip of rain against the warped window pane. A clock ticks on the wall, its hands creeping towards 7, marking another evening in a house that's grown too large for its dwindling occupants. The back door rattles suddenly, a sharp gust shaking it in its frame, and Sarah glances up, her brow furrowing at the unexpected sound. She pauses, the wooden spoon hovering over the pot, her heart giving a small, unsteady thud. Then a knock, sharp, deliberate, insistent, pierces the quiet, sending a jolt through her fragile body. She sets the spoon down with a clatter, wiping her hands on a faded apron stained with years of meals, and shuffles toward the door, her slippers scuffing the worn linoleum. Her breath comes uneven, a mix of curiosity and an old, buried dread she can't quite name. Through the smudged glass of the door, she sees a silhouette, tall, broad-shouldered, a dark shape against the fading light, unfamiliar yet hauntingly known. Her fingers hover over the latch, trembling as a flood of possibilities rushes through her mind. A neighbor, a stranger, a ghost from a past she's tried to forget. She hesitates, her pulse quickening, before unlatching it with a slow, reluctant turn, the metal cold against her skin. The door swings open, creaking on rusty hinges, and reveals Michael, her 35-year-old son, standing in the drizzle. His dark hair clings wetly to his forehead, droplets sliding down his unshaven jaw, and his leather jacket glistens with rain, the scent of damp earth and motor oil drifting in with him. His face, hardened by nearly 2 decades away, carries only a shadow of the boy she once cradled, but his eyes, sharp, guarded, a deep green like hers, hold a story she's not sure she's ready to hear. Sarah freezes, her hand gripping the doorframe so tightly her knuckles whiten, as recognition crashes over her like a wave. Michael steps forward, his heavy boots leaving wet prints on the splintered porch boards, and speaks in a voice low and rough, saying he's come back. The words hit her like a punch, stealing the air from her lungs, and her lips part, but no sound escapes. Her mind reels, torn between a mother's relief and a deep, gnawing dread. She hasn't seen him since he was 17, since that night of screams and shattered glass when he stormed out, his voice raw with fury as he vowed never to return to this house, to her, to his father, James, whose heavy hand and heavier words drove him into the night. 18 years of silence, broken now by this figure on her doorstep, and she doesn't know whether to pull him close or push him away. She manages a whisper, her voice cracking as she asks why he's here after all this time, her eyes searching his face for answers. Michael's jaw tightens, a muscle twitching beneath the stubble, and he glances past her into the house, his gaze lingering on the shadows within, the dim hallway, the flickering light, the ghosts he left behind. He explained she's sick. He heard through an old friend who still lingered in this forgotten town, and he couldn't stay away, not now, not when she's slipping from him. Sarah's eyes well with tears, blurring his outline, but suspicion flickers beneath her fragile hope. She knows this house holds memories he swore to bury, demons he fled to escape. She asks what he wants, her voice trembling with a mix of longing and fear, her fingers tightening on the frame as if to steady herself against the weight of his return. Michael hesitates, rain dripping from his hair onto his collar. then says he's here for her. Not James, not the past, just her. His tone firm but edged with something unspoken. The air shifts, thick with the promise of confrontation, as heavy footsteps echo from the hallway beyond the kitchen. James, a 62-year-old man with a barrel chest and a face carved from years of anger and hard living, appears in the doorway, his flannel shirt stretched taut over his frame, his presence filling the space like a storm cloud rolling in. His eyes, bloodshot and narrowed, land on Michael, and his voice rumbles, deep and menacing, demanding to know what the hell he's doing here. Michael straightens, his shoulders squaring as he meets his father's glare, and the tension crackles like lightning ready to strike, sharp and electric. Sarah steps between them, her frail form a trembling barrier, her hands raised as she pleads for calm, her voice lost in the growing roar of the rain outside. What brought Michael back? Duty, guilt, or something darker lurking beneath his steady gaze? The storm drums harder against the roof, drowning out any hope of an answer, leaving only questions swirling in its wake, pulling the past into a collision course with the present. Inside the farmhouse kitchen, the air grows thick with the weight of unspoken history, heavy and oppressive, as Michael stands just inside the back door, water dripping from his leather jacket onto the cracked linoleum floor. The faint patter of rain against the window mixes with the hiss of the stove, where a pot of watery soup simmers unattended, steam curling upward in lazy tendrils. Sarah hovers near the counter, her frail hands wringing the faded apron tied around her waist, her tired eyes darting between her son and the looming figure of her husband. The dim overhead light flickers faintly, casting jittery shadows across the room, amplifying the tension that coils tighter with each passing second. Michael shifts his weight, his wet boots scuffing the floor, his posture rigid but his gaze steady, locked on the man who drove him away all those years ago. James looms in the doorway, his broad frame blocking the faint glow from the hallway, his barrel chest rising and falling with barely contained fury. His flannel shirt, stained with grease and sweat, stretches taut across his shoulders, and his fists clench at his sides, knuckles whitening as he takes in the sight of his son, returned, uninvited, after 18 years of silence. He repeats his question, his voice a low growl that rumbles through the room like distant thunder, demanding to know what Michael thinks he's doing, showing up after all this time like nothing happened, like the past could be erased with a single knock. Michael's eyes flash with defiance, a spark of the boy who once stood up to him, but he keeps his tone steady, deliberate, saying he's here for his mother, not for James, not for this house, not for the wreckage they left behind. Sarah's voice breaks through the standoff, frail but insistent, cutting the air like a thin thread stretched to its limit. She begs them not to start this again. Not now, not when she's barely holding on, her words trembling as they spill out. Her hands rise to her chest, clutching the apron as if it could shield her from the storm brewing between the two men she loves, the two men who've torn her heart in opposite directions for decades. James scoffs, his lip curling into a sneer, and accuses Michael of running off like a coward, leaving them to pick up the pieces of a family he shattered with his selfish escape. His voice drips with contempt, each word a jab meant to draw blood, to reopen wounds that never fully healed. Michael steps forward, his boots leaving a trail of damp prints, and retorts sharply that he didn't run. He escaped because staying meant more bruises, more nights lying awake wondering if James's temper would finally cross the line from fists to something worse. The words land like blows, raw and unfiltered, and Sarah flinches, her hands rising to her face as if to block the flood of memories they unleash. Nights of raised voices, broken dishes, Michael's muffled sobs from behind a locked bedroom door. Her eyes glisten with tears, but she says nothing, trapped in the echo of a past she couldn't fix. A silence falls, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on the room until James growls again, his voice rougher now, insisting Michael has no right to judge. He was a kid who didn't understand sacrifice, who threw away family for his own freedom, leaving Sarah to cry herself to sleep while James worked to keep a roof over their heads. His words are a twisted defense, a justification warped by years of denial, and they stoke the fire in Michael's chest. Michael's laugh cuts through the room, bitter and jagged, a sound that carries the weight of every sleepless night he spent nursing his wounds, physical and otherwise, far from this place. He asks what kind of family beats their own into submission, his voice rising as he steps closer, his green eyes blazing with a fury he's held onto for 18 years. He points at James, his hand steady despite the tremor of rage beneath it, and accuses him of turning love into a weapon, of making this house a prison Michael had to claw his way out of. Sarah's tears spill over, streaking her hollow cheeks, and she pleads with Michael to stop, her voice cracking as she admits she's dying. She doesn't have time for this fight, doesn't have the strength to watch them tear each other apart again. Michael's anger falters, his breath catching as he turns to his mother, really seeing her for the first time since he walked in, the hollows beneath her eyes, the way her sweater hangs loose on a frame wasting away, the faint wheeze in her chest with every word. His defiance softens, replaced by a pang of guilt, and he crosses the room in 3 quick strides, kneeling beside her chair. He promises he's here to help, to take care of her like she deserved all those years he was gone, his voice low and earnest, a vow meant to mend what little he can. James snorts, turning away toward the sink, but his shoulders slump slightly, a crack in his armored pride he can't hide. Michael asks Sarah what she needs, medicine, a doctor, a blanket, anything, and she clutches his hand, her fingers cold and frail, whispering she just wants peace before the end, a wish that feels impossibly distant. But peace slips further away as James mutters under his breath, his back still turned, calling Michael a liar who'll bolt again when it gets tough, when the reality of her illness sinks in. The words are a taunt, a dare, and Michael rises, his fists tightening at his sides, his voice dropping to a warning as he tells James to stay out of his way. He's not that scared kid anymore, not the boy who cowered under those fists. The room trembles with their unresolved rage, a fault line ready to split wide open, and Sarah's quiet sob cuts through it, a desperate plea for something they might never give her, something beyond the pain they've all carried too long. What drives Michael now? Love for his mother, a need for redemption, or a simmering thirst for revenge against the man who broke him? The answer lurks just out of reach, a shadow moving beneath the surface, pulling the past into a collision with the present that promises no easy resolution. Days pass in the old farmhouse, each one blending into the next as an uneasy rhythm settles over its creaking walls and weathered floors. The rain has softened to a drizzle, tapping lightly against the windows, while the gray sky outside casts a muted light through the dusty curtains. Michael moves into his old bedroom upstairs, a cramped space unchanged since he left at 17. Faded posters of rock bands cling to the peeling paint, their edges curling inward, and a thin layer of dust coats the desk where he once scribbled angry notes he never sent. The mattress sags under his weight as he sits, staring at the familiar cracks in the ceiling, memories seeping in like damp through the walls, nights of muffled shouts, the sting of his father's belt, the quiet resolve that carried him out the door. He shakes them off, rolling his shoulders, and heads downstairs, determined to focus on the present, on Sarah. In the mornings, he tends to her with a care that feels both foreign and instinctive, his broad hands steady as he brings her a chipped mug of tea, the steam rising in faint wisps. Sarah lies propped against pillows on the sagging couch in the living room, a quilt draped over her legs, its patchwork faded from years of use. Her cough grows harsher with each passing day, rattling through her thin frame like a storm shaking loose branches, and Michael's face tightens every time he hears it, a quiet panic flickering in his green eyes. He adjusts her pillows, coaxing her to sip the tea, his voice low and gentle as he urges her to eat a spoonful of the broth he's warmed, thin, watery stuff, but it's all she can keep down now. Her hands tremble as she takes the mug, her fingers brushing his, and she offers a weak smile, a ghost of the warmth she once radiated when he was small. James keeps his distance, retreating to the barn or the porch, his heavy footsteps a brooding echo through the house. His presence lingers like a shadow, dark and unyielding, his absence from Sarah's side a silent refusal to bridge the gap Michael's return has widened. The barn door slams shut each morning as he disappears into his work, tinkering with rusted tools, mending fences that don't need fixing, his way of avoiding the son he can't face, the wife he can't save. Inside, Michael sits beside Sarah, pulling an old book of poetry from a shelf, its spine cracked and pages yellowed. He reads aloud, his voice rough but steady, reciting lines she loved when he was a boy, simple verses about fields and skies, words that once lulled him to sleep after nights of chaos. Sarah's eyes flutter closed, her breathing easing for a moment, and her smile deepens, a flicker of the mother who held him through the worst of it. She stirs, her voice faint as she asks him about his life, where he's been, what he's done in the 18 years he's been gone. Michael shifts in his chair, the wood creaking under him, and answers in fragments. Odd jobs up north, a stint in the city driving trucks, a quiet life in a nowhere town far from here. His words are clipped, guarded, and his jaw tightens when she presses for more, about friends, a family, something to fill the void of his absence. He deflects, changing the subject, asking if she's comfortable, if she needs another blanket, his tone softening to steer her away from the parts of himself he's not ready to share. She nods, letting it drop, but her eyes linger on him, searching for the boy she lost beneath the man he's become. The fragile piece shatters when James stomps in from the cold, his boots leaving smears of mud across the linoleum. His breath smells faintly of whiskey, a habit he's never shaken, and his bloodshot eyes narrow as they land on Michael, sitting there with the book like some prodigal saint. He accuses him of playing the hero now, his voice a rough bark, saying Michael couldn't be bothered to show up when it mattered, when Sarah cried for him, when the farm nearly went under. Michael sets the book down carefully, his jaw clenching as he rises, replying he's here because Sarah asked, not for James's approval, not for his judgment. His words are measured, but the anger simmers beneath them, a current ready to break loose. Sarah's voice, weak but firm, cuts through the rising storm, telling James to let it go. She needs Michael now, whether James likes it or not, her plea edged with a desperation that silences the room for a heartbeat. James's face twists, a mix of rage and something softer, grief, perhaps, or shame, and he storms out, the door slamming behind him with a force that rattles the windows. Sarah's hand finds Michael's, her grip feeble but insistent, and she whispers she never stopped hoping he'd come back, her voice breaking on the words. Michael's throat tightens, his eyes stinging as he admits he almost didn't. The memories were too heavy, the fear of James too deep, the guilt of leaving her too much to bear. She asks if he can forgive James, her gaze pleading, a mother's last wish for a peace she'll never see. Michael hesitates, his hand curling into a fist on his knee, and says he's not sure forgiveness is in him. Not yet, maybe not ever. The truce holds, but it's thin, stretched taut by the weight of old wounds and the ticking clock of Sarah's fading time. What will break it? Her loss, a buried truth, or the rage neither man can let go? The drizzle outside persists, a quiet drumbeat to a story still unfolding, its end shrouded in shadow. Weeks blend into a haze within the old farmhouse, its creaking walls and weathered floors a fragile cocoon around Sarah's dwindling strength. The drizzle has given way to a biting chill, frost tracing delicate patterns on the windows as winter creeps closer. Michael's days revolve around his mother, measuring out pills into a trembling palm, spooning broth past her cracked lips, sitting vigil through restless nights as her breathing grows shallower. The living room, once a battlefield of shouted accusations, has softened into a quiet sanctuary, the couch now her permanent perch beneath a quilt that smells faintly of lavender and thyme. Sarah's eyes, clouded with fatigue, follow Michael as he moves, her frail hand reaching for his whenever he's near, anchoring herself to the sun she's reclaimed against all odds. James lingers on the edges of this fragile world, his presence a brooding shadow that rarely crosses the threshold of her space. He spends his days in the barn, the clatter of tools a distant echo, or on the porch, nursing a bottle of whiskey that's become his silent companion. His gruff exterior cracks in stolen glances through the window at Sarah, his rough hands idle without her to steady them, his eyes red-rimmed from more than just the cold. One evening, as dusk paints the sky in streaks of purple and gray, Sarah's breathing falters, each inhale a labored rasp that cuts through the stillness. Michael sits by her bedside, an old mattress dragged into the living room, holding her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles as she drifts in and out. She murmurs his name, her voice a fragile thread fraying at the edges, and he squeezes her fingers, promising he's not leaving. Not this time, not when she needs him most. James enters, his heavy boots scuffing the floor, his presence a sudden weight in the room. For once, he doesn't challenge Michael, doesn't fill the space with his usual bluster. He sits on the other side of Sarah, his broad frame hunched, his rough hands hovering over hers, uncertain and unsteady. Sarah opens her eyes briefly, her gaze shifting between them, and whispers she wants them to try for her, if not for each other, her words a plea carried on her last reserves of strength. Michael nods, his throat tight with unshed tears, and James grunts, a reluctant sound that's as close to agreement as he'll come. The room holds its breath, a rare stillness settling over the two men who've waged war across decades, their shared grief a tenuous bridge over the chasm of their past. But that fragile peace shatters at dawn when Sarah slips away, her final breath a quiet sigh against the pale light filtering through the frost-laced window. Michael stands frozen by her side, his face a mask of grief, his hands still clasped around hers, as if he could pull her back. James collapses into a chair across the room, his head dropping into his hands, a low, guttural sound escaping him, a sob, a growl, a release of something held too long. Hours pass in silence, the house eerily still without her soft coughs or murmured words, until James rises, his voice hoarse and ragged. He tells Michael to leave. Sarah's gone, and there's nothing left for him here, his words a command undercut by the tremor in them. Michael's eyes blaze, his grief igniting into defiance, and he refuses, saying this is his home too, whether James admits it or not, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. The argument escalates, old wounds bleeding anew under the strain of loss. James blames Michael for abandoning them, his voice rising as he accuses him of running when Sarah needed him most, of leaving her to face James's temper alone. Michael throws back years of abuse, his words sharp and unyielding, nights of hiding bruises, days of fearing the next blow, a childhood stolen by a man too broken to love without hurting. A glass shatters against the wall, flung by James in a burst of fury, its shards scattering across the floor like the fragments of their family. Michael storms outside, the cold rain soaking through his jacket as he stands in the yard, staring at the house that's both refuge and prison. James follows, shouting into the storm, his voice raw with rage and despair, but stops short when Michael turns, rain streaking his face, and says he's staying. Not for James, not for forgiveness, but for Sarah's memory, for the promise he made her. James falters, his shoulders slumping as the fight drains out of him, and he retreats inside, the door slamming shut with a hollow thud. Michael stands alone in the downpour, his breath fogging in the cold, his gaze fixed on the farmhouse as water drips from his hair. The wind carries a faint rustle, and a letter slips from Sarah's bedside table, unnoticed in the chaos, her handwriting scrawled across the envelope, unopened, addressed to both Michael and James in a shaky script. It flutters to the floor, landing among the glass shards, its contents a mystery. Forgiveness she couldn't voice, a final plea for peace, or a truth too late to mend what's broken. The storm rages on, the rain hammering the roof, and Michael's choice looms, unresolved, a decision to stay and face the past or walk away from it forever, pulling viewers into the next thread of this fractured family's unraveling tale.